So, what is the difference in practice between a fitness cue and an actual demonstration of reproductive fitness? Like, what's the explain the distinction more?
For example, you see the gap in the kind of red pill manosphere pickup artist community, right? Where guys are running around and they're chasing cues of sexual success, cues of sexual validation. So they might be having sex with a lot of apparently fertile young women, but they're not actually having babies. Why not? Contraception, right? So they're cutting the link between chasing these cues of sexual success, which is like getting laid a lot, but they're not actually having babies. So from a Darwinian point of view, right, what they're doing is actually no better reproductively than staying home and watching porn, right? Evolution doesn't care whether you're staying home and watching porn or having non-reproductive, non-conceptive sex with a bunch of women. It's equally futile from a Darwinian point of view. So my concept with this sort of limbic capitalism insight is that an awful lot of what we're doing is sort of running around chasing these fitness cues and kind of forgetting to have actual babies. So this kind of ties into my pronatalism enthusiasm and my kind of concern about demographic collapse and birth rates and all of that stuff.
Yeah, concern that we share. So the trap that we end up in at this point of development as an intelligent species is that we are so good at distracting ourselves from the actual sort of bare bones of Darwinian selection that we just become extinct. Like ultimately, like it's a very real existential threat to a species, even though it doesn't feel like that in the moment. It doesn't feel like plague and war and asteroids and all of that sort of thing, but it's the effects is pretty much the same.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't feel like an existential threat the way that global thermonuclear war felt as a potential threat in the 80s when I was growing up and going to college and worried about that. It doesn't feel like even an existential threat the way that artificial superintelligence feels. And yet, the better the AI gets, the more tempting all of these interactive media will get, so that you'll end up with a bunch of young people running around with virtual boyfriends and girlfriends rather than real boyfriends and girlfriends. Or if they have any parental instincts, right, they might even fulfill those instincts by having kind of virtual babies or kids that they interact with a little bit. At the end of that essay that I wrote 15 years ago, I did have a kind of glimmer of hope that I offered, which is that there might be certain human subcultures that are relatively resistant to getting caught up in this trap. But they tend to be kind of religious fundamentalist groups that are wary of technology in general. And I mentioned specifically kind of fundamentalist Muslims and fundamentalist Amish or Mennonites or like real hardcore trad lifers who are just generally skeptical of electronic technology. So as long as some people are still having kids, right, human evolution continues, and there will gradually evolve a resistance to video games, a resistance to virtual reality, a kind of horror of those things as being, after a few hundred generations, you could sort of imagine people having the same disgust and horror and animosity towards video games that they now have towards highly infectious, dangerous parasites.
Mm. But I suppose it's more of a, if we're thinking about religious subcultures, it's a form of cultural resistance. Presumably, there are also some individuals who are more resistant to the delights of limbic capitalism.
Yes.
And would we expect that also to be selected for, regardless of which subculture they come from?
Yeah, exactly. I think any heritable individual differences that can be passed on genetically or passed on culturally will tend to spread under this kind of limbic capitalism context. So like, you're into having babies, I'm into having babies. Lots of people are. They don't necessarily need a religious fundamentalist reason to do it, although it can help. And so you can predict that over generations, as long as humanity survives at all, that the kind of people who are still laser focused on actual reproductive success will end up being the ones who are great grandparents to many descendants, and the ones who are easily distracted will end up being great grandparents to nobody.
Do you think it's possible that people might just break out? I mean, limbic capitalism offers a whole load of different distractions, right? Not just in relation to actual reproduction. Do you think that some people might break out just sort of from the reproductive trap, but otherwise continue to enjoy video games, to continue to enjoy junk food, or do you think that maybe there's uh, a suite of personality traits which makes one resistant to all of it? Is it sort of all or nothing? Either you are sucked into the great temptation and you end up sterilizing yourself, or you're not. What do you think?
I think there's a happy middle ground. I mean, I try to follow that happy middle ground myself. I mean, God knows I'm pretty addicted to Twitter, aka X, right? And yet I still try to be a pretty good dad to my kids. I will still occasionally play Civilization, the video game, and watch TV, and do all the other normal like middle class entertainment stuff. So I think you don't have to be super puritanical about resisting this great temptation, and you could probably have like about 70% as much limbic capitalist fun as incels and non-breeders and non-parents have, and still have kids. But the worry is, well, play it forward another 20 or 30 years, right? How good will the distractions get? How good will AI fake girlfriends and boyfriends get? How good will immersive virtual reality get? You could get to a point where it's just extremely hard to resist those temptations unless you never start them in the first place. Kind of like a lot of people know, oh, if I tried heroin once, I probably would become a smackhead, and so I just won't do it at all.
It seems to me as well that one of the other problems with the ever better consumer options is runaway status signaling. And because I mean, that's very strongly the impression I get as to why the sort of upper middle classes seem to be particularly averse to having children. It's because they're not like the very rich, who I think that in America it's something like when you have an income of over 500,000 a year, your birth rate goes up again. But there's this big valley in the middle where people don't have enough money to just spend as much as they want on consumables and on status signifying consumables, crucially. And they know that there's a trade-off between having children and having all of these nice house, nice car, all of these things, holidays. And so they choose the status game over the having children game. Obviously, we see the Darwinian implications of that. Do you think that as well is do you think that is a particular function of the sort of modern offerings? There is absolutely no ceiling on the amount of money that you can spend on making yourself seem high status, right? Compared with other cultures. Or is it, I don't know, but maybe that was always true. Maybe it's just maybe it's just that we have contraception and our ancestors didn't. Maybe they would have also whittled all of their money away on things that made them look high status. I don't know.
I mean, consumerist capitalism is incredibly inventive about offering these kinds of status-seeking opportunities, not just in terms of quality, but also in terms of diversity, so that no matter what your personality traits, no matter what your personal interests and values, there's going to be some kind of status game you can play that will appeal to that value. So, for example, you could be anti-materialist. You could be an intellectual. You could go, oh, I don't care about status through yachts and Fendi handbags, but I do care about status for getting a PhD and tenure and all that cool stuff, right? And that's my status game. And so it's the diversity of different kinds of consumables and goods and services and different career options that mean almost everybody faces some kind of temptation to get caught up in runaway status games somehow, right? And that's kind of a distinctive thing about modernity that perhaps didn't exist in the same way, 1,000 years ago. And that was a major point in my book, Spent, that there's this fundamental trade-off between runaway status seeking versus having babies. And man, consumerist capitalism is very, very good at offering this smorgasbord of status enhancing opportunities.